What makes up a soul in the warp? Does everything alive have one? Why is time in the warp not like time in the material universe? And how do you see the future using the nature of the warp? Friends, let's find out, and welcome to a 40k lore video. General spoiler warning from here. So let's break this down. First we examine the soul and the warp, starting with the nature of emotions and the soul itself. If we go back to Realm of Chaos, it says that the warp is an alternative universe composed entirely of psychic energy, generated by the thoughts, emotions and intellectual activity of living beings. It's a spiritual reflection of the life of the entire galaxy, and for this reason it is sometimes called the Sea of Souls. So what is a soul? I think a great definition for a soul is thoughts, emotions and intellectual activity of living beings. So if the warp is generated by those living, etc., then before the awakening of Slaanesh, it would have still existed, but been calmer. Again from Realm of Chaos, originally the warp was filled with the natural psychic forces of animals and plants, so that its energies flowed harmoniously and fluidly, creating a uniting force that moved physically through all living creatures. When the first intelligent beings developed, their individual and extremely potent minds filled the warp with new and powerful psychic energies. So we're talking about the first psyches there, possibly the old ones. I think the warp gets generally a little mischaracterized. We say emotion, I think, how can that apply to Nurgle? Nurgle's just decay. It's not an emotion, but things associated with it are. Fear of death could be seen as something that falls under Nurgle and is an emotion. And further, if thoughts, emotions and intellectual activity of living beings exist in the warp, then the demons are not just formed from emotional energy, but also parts of the thoughts and intellectual activity of those beings that exist in the warp through them being alive and having those representations there. So let's take Khorne. It's always an easy example. Again, to make it simple, Khorne is just made of the angry energy of people within the warp, but he can also be associated with intellectual parts of the soul, because we need an understanding of what anger is to know what makes us angry and why it makes us angry, and that can all be bound up within Khorne and making him blood for the blood god, etc. A summary of all those emotions, thoughts and intellectual activity bound up within the blood god. And to tackle the memories in there, if you think it's just emotions in the warp, then let me refer to Mechanicum by Graham McNeil, where the mistress of Magma City, Corviel Zeth, created a device called the Akashic Reader. This would tap into the sum of all knowledge she believed was in the warp, the Empyrean. It needs psychics to power it is the first thing, and is rather like the setup for the Astronomicon actually. And using this device, some information was taken from the warp before the empath in control was incinerated. Now it was later destroyed by Zeth, so it didn't fall into the hands of the new Mechanicum. But when he taps into this theorised sum of all knowledge in the warp, that could be all the memories of those alive and possibly those dead. And this could also include knowledge from the future due to the nature of the warp. I will come back to that a little later in the video. And so conveniently, what about time in the warp? I mean, where would it exist there when it's a place of emotions? Think about that first. So let's look at an example from The Emperor. We turn to the fantastic Arundhati Bowden Horus novel, The Master of Mankind, where we get so much great lore about the Emperor, who he was and who he is. And there the Emperor tells a Custodes, Endymion Ra if memory serves, about his future sight, his prescience, which I think is tied to the warp clearly. Future seeing, that is foresight Ra, to know 1,000,000,000,000 possible futures, and to be left to guess at the infinite ways of arriving at each one, taking into account every decision that every living being will make that will impact upon the others around it, will take all of the lifetimes I have already lived, and minute after minute, possibility upon possibility, path after path, all variables you are unable to see from where you stand at this moment. I can see the coast Ra, I know what awaits me there, but I cannot see all the infinite vicissitudes between here and there. Now we need to look at time in the warp in a different way and think how this will affect the far-seeing of the Emperor. The warp is defined as an alternative or parallel dimension tied to our own, in which the laws of space and time are different to those of our universe. Now we get a lot of prophetic visions in 40k, so many characters. How could that work from the above description of the warp? It's made from the intellectual activity within the warp. So I think if you settle down into a nice sleep, like and subscribe, despite the nightmares you battle there, and then wake up, that mental activity goes out into the warp. So it makes sense when you dream and have visions, they are also linked into the warp. If you get visions of the future, such as with Sanguinius and his visions of his death, or with Conrad Kurz, who in his Primarch novel, really good, check it out, meets a boy. And Kurz sees all the paths the boy could follow after meeting Kurz, how the boy could have been an ally, for example. And then Kurz cuts those threads to apply his justice. But where do these visions come from? I think the warp by its nature does not tie into normal linear time. Think of a blank piece of paper and a line that goes from A to B. That's linear time, at least as I understand it as a science fiction fan. The warp is different. You'll have heard of ships entering the warp and coming out further back in time than where they entered. We also have an incident where some of the followers of Abaddon the Despoiler, who aren't actually his followers yet. This is from one of the Black Legion novels. We hear how the Imperium is now ruled by a religious order and the Emperor worshipped. And when they hear it, members of the Black Legion find this hilarious because they didn't know about it. The time they spent in the warp does not measure in length to the amount of time that has gone on in the Materium. So without trying to explain the nature of time as I am now Time Lord, I think the warp touches on our reality at every point in time. Think of that line again and the warp connecting to each moment of that line. If the lines between A and B represent all of time from the beginning to the end of the galaxy. So if someone gets a vision of the future or a possible future, I think it must be from one of the warp's connections to the galaxy or possible galaxies. Now if you think of that line and imagine an infinite number of lines set next to each other, the warp connects to each of them, I think. So we know from what we covered earlier that the Emperor can see multiple futures, and many people making many different choices creates an infinite number of ones he has to pass through. So why not also with the visions? If many threads of time come out from each person, perhaps certain Primarchs and others can see these threads and then prune them to bring them nearer to the one they want to choose. Though there is of course so much to get through, it's no guarantee. And a little more evidence from the Master of Mankind on time in the warp. Now this is from around the time of the birth of Dracnian. Before the veil, in the warp, there is no when and then. Everything is now, always and eternally now, in the shifting tides of an infinite malignance. And in terms of what's in the warp, from our example of the Akashic record, we have from the same book this quote: "In the creature's shrieking journey across the warp, it touches the minds of every human who has ever, was, and will ever be, from the long dead to those yet to be born. The demon is tied to the species through such primal intimacy that every man, woman, and child knows its caress deep in their blood and bones, even if they know nothing of its name. So the future that is seen are tied to the possibilities through the timeless lens or access point of the warp." Hope that gives you an idea of what I was going for. I don't feel I've quite nailed it, but I've done my best to put across my theory. So the question is, do beings in 40k need souls to live? Earlier in the video we learned the warp was filled with the natural psychic forces of animals and plants, so that their energies flowed harmoniously and fluidly, creating a uniting force that moved physically through all living creatures. When the first intelligent races developed, their individual and extremely potent minds filled the warp with new and powerful energies. So even animals and plants have a low signature in the warp. So I think when something is born or grown, it has a warp signature as a natural part of the galaxy. And if you're self-aware, you have that soul when you were born. It's always there, that reflection of you. Because everything in the Materium has reflection in the Immaterium. And that's my grand theory of souls, their birthing, and how time is in the warp, remember, always now, and future seeing, and how it's tied through the warp and the infinite possible number of futures that branch out from that one point that you need to look through to try and possibly reach one of them. Now this video has gone through a lot of drafts, more than I usually do. In fact, it was originally started as a video examining if the Emperor could bring back the Primarchs. You can perhaps see some of this research and how that would apply to that idea, and ask the question, did he plan for it? And then the video grew and contracted and grew again with additional information until I felt it was not on the original subject, but there's enough interesting stuff there that I want to talk about the warp and souls. Oh, it's a really interesting subject, for me at least, in 40k. and that's the point I ended up talking on. Anyway, with that bit, I'll wrap up today's video. Let me know what you think here. Is there any additional lore we could add to this to grow and expand it, or to contradict it? I'll be very interested to hear from you. So drop me a comment down below.